I had mentioned earlier in the announcements, and I took a little longer on that because I wanted to go over some of the highlights of the regional conference with you. Some portions of the material I'll be saving and covering in coming sermons and things of that nature. But one of the things that I did mention concerned the presentation that Mr. Randall Dick gave in terms of our youth programs and some updating of that. We're in the process of developing a revision and an updating of our YOU program. And he went over some of the things that were associated with that. We went back and looked at what is our purpose, what is our desire, and I want to focus in on some of that because it relates not only to the church youth program, but it relates very directly to our child rearing that is involved. We are focusing in on 6 different areas that we're in the process of developing a revised manual on YOU, and focusing in on 6 areas that we want to highlight, that we want to promote, that we want, in which we would like to reward excellence, that we feel 6 areas of emphasis that would involve really the whole person, would involve the academic area, the athletic area, the area of citizenship and character. The 4th area would be cultural. 5th area would be spiritual, and the 6th area would be vocational. And it is our desire to promote, as was said, the 3 legs of the program have to do with growth, excellence, and quality recognition. That is something that we want to emphasize in our program, and we want to promote and emphasize in individuals and in our young people. We want to promote, we want to recognize and encourage personal growth and development. We want to emphasize a commitment to excellence, and we want to recognize and reward quality. It might be interesting to note that almost 14,000 of those who are baptized members in the church are what we term second-generation Christians. They're those who grew up in the church, and some, of course, grew up for their entire lives in it. Others came in, or their parents began attending when they were teenagers, but they were teenagers in the church, began attending with their parents. And that, looked at from that standpoint, there is that emphasis and sort of a refining and a redefining of what should be our approach, which brings us to what really is and must be the crucial thrust of our child rearing in our own personal families. It has to be the crucial thrust of our youth programs if they are to be successful. And that is that ultimately our goal, our striving must be to lead our youth to the realization that God's way works. Now that's maybe a very simple statement, but we're looking at a transition from young childhood, where everything is controlled and all sorts of things are done for them, to a transition to adulthood. And if ultimately a person comes to the realization that God's way works and understand what that way encompasses, then that is ultimately the goal. The youth program of the church cannot be a substitute for the parental role in child rearing. Our role in terms of the church is to serve as a as a help to the parents in their role of teaching their children, to serve as a reinforcement by reinforcing those things, to provide an environment that is conducive to the development of those values, to provide opportunities in an organized way to recognize our young people and give proper recognition. But ultimately, the crucial thrust in our child rearing, and we have to keep it in mind with any youth program that we have or that we develop, is that we're trying as parents, and we're trying to aid that as a church through the leading of our youth to the realization that God's way works. Now, when we focus on that and on the importance of leading our young people to that realization, one thing that comes to mind that we have to focus on is the difference, understanding a little bit of the difference between leadership and management. Now, there's a very crucial distinction there between leadership and management. It's the distinction between what we could term as the top line and the bottom line. To give you an example, imagine you've got this jungle, this dense undergrowth. It reminds me of back about 3 or 4 years ago, when Terry Richardson and I were up in that area of, right on the Mississippi-Louisiana state lines, where we've taken some of our young boys for a wild youth camp out on a couple of different occasions. And we had gone up there to scout the area. And we were looking for a shortcut through. We were trying to get through in this area, and it wasn't long before we wound up in this great just wilderness. I mean, it was overgrown. There were just everything, and we had a machete along, and so we were trying to get through there. And when we got through there, which we finally did, we didn't really know where we were. We weren't a whole lot better off having gotten through there. I tell this, Terry Richardson isn't here to defend himself, but we had started out through there, and we had a topographical map. Now, neither of us had ever been to this area. And he was assuring me that, he can read these things. He said, I was over in Vietnam. He says, I know all about these things. I won't tell you how long we wandered around in that area, but we finally got out. And he hasn't been discussing his topographical map skills since then, to my knowledge. But anyway, you can imagine here now. You got. I want to illustrate the difference between leadership and management. If you've got you got people out here and they're whacking their way through all this dense undergrowth, and they've got machetes. Now, management, if you've got good management, they're going to be concerned, make sure the machetes are sharp, place the guys far enough apart to where on the one hand they're not whacking one another with the machetes, so you don't get them too close, but you don't get them so far away that it's inefficient. So you get them placed just the right amount so that they're just out of reach of one another, and yet they can move through with maximum efficiency. You make sure that you've got some mosquito netting along so that when you set up camp for the evening, everybody's comfortable. You're taking care of all these details and trying to operate efficiently, keep the machete sharp, keep people moving through. That's fine. But the leader is the guy that climbs the tallest tree, looks out around there and says, hey, we're in the wrong jungle. The manager is saying, hey, we're making great progress, and the leader says, yeah, but we're in the wrong jungle. We don't need to be making progress here. Where we need to be is over there. That was a little bit of what we needed when we were hacking our way through, only to come out to find out that when we got where we were no better off, and than if we had not gotten there. Now, the point is that in terms of a distinction, management has to do with how can I best accomplish this or that. How is the best way, the most efficient way, the most effective way to accomplish it, while leadership has to do with what do I want to accomplish. Now, there's a difference, because a lot of times, a lot of child rearing has been focused on how to do it. How much should you spank, and how much should you punish this way, and how should you do that? We've looked at all sorts of tools to how to do this and how to do that. A lot of how-to books. We can even bog down in terms of even youth programs and things in the church where we're running around and our emphasis is on how to do this and how to do that. Well, how to do something is important, but what's even more important in our child rearing and in any other area is not simply how do you go about doing it, how's the most effective, how's the most efficient, should you do it this way or that way, but rather to step back and look at what is it we're trying to accomplish. Where do we want to be? Where is the end result that we desire to be? Where do we want to be? It's not just how to get there. You know, you can race through efficiently and effective and get somewhere only to find out that you're in the wrong place. You got there effectively, but you may not be where you want to be. And ultimately the thrust, if we step back and if we develop and focus in our own lives as parents, and as we focus, and this was part of the great emphasis in the lecture that Mr. Dick had, this emphasis on the fact that God's way works. And ultimately, what we're after is leading our children to the realization that God's way works. Now, that's what God tells us in Deuteronomy in chapter 6. He lays it out very simply, in a direct way. He says, "Now these are the commandments, the statutes, and the judgments, which the eternal your God commanded to teach you, that you might do them in the land where you go to possess it. That you might fear the eternal your God, to keep all of his statutes and his commandments, which I command you, and your son, and your son's son, all the days of your life, that your days may be prolonged. Hear therefore, O Israel, and observe to do it, that it may be well with you, that you may increase mightily, as the eternal God of your fathers has promised you in the land which flows with milk and honey. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. These words which I command you this day shall be in your heart." This is a concept, God said, you are to internalize. That the basis of your life and the basis of the direction of your life revolves around the fact that God is to be loved with our whole heart and mind and being. That our lives are to be centered upon God and godly principles. And he said, "You," verse 7, "shall teach them diligently unto your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up." Now he mentions two things here in verse 7. He says you're to teach it and you're to talk of it. Now the term for teach is a word that has more of the connotation of formal instruction. The word in the Hebrew literally means to whet or to sharpen. So it has to do with diligently sharpening our children. I know the word sharpening them in various areas, teaching them, giving instruction, and talking to them. Now, this has to do with more informal talking of them. When you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up. Taking advantage of circumstances on a day-in, day-out basis. Not simply limiting it to formal instruction. But we are to teach and to talk. Verse 8, you're to bind them, speaking of God's law, for a sign upon your hand. There shall be as frontlets between your eyes. In other words, it is to be there. You know, what is between your eyes? Well, that's the seat of intellect. Your hands have to do with what you do. Your mind with what you think. So God's law is to control both our thoughts and our actions. You shall write them upon the post of your house and on your gates. So we were to keep ourselves in constant reminder and memory of God's law, and it is to permeate our lives. It is to permeate our lives in controlling our actions and our thoughts. And it shall be, verse 10, when the Eternal your God shall have brought you into the land which he swore unto your fathers, to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob, to give you great and goodly cities which you build not, and houses full of all good things which you filled not, and wells digged which you digged not, vineyards and olive trees which you planted not, when you shall have eaten and be full, then beware lest you forget the Eternal, which brought you out forth from the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage. You shall serve the Lord your God and fear him, and must swear by his name. You shall not go after other gods, the gods of the people round about. For God is a jealous God. His anger will be kindled. So God requires exclusive worship. God requires our exclusive devotion. Verse 16, you shall not tempt the Eternal your God as you tempted him in Massah. Now this has to do with Israel's response. You could read it back in Exodus chapter 17 in verse 7, where it talked about they call the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because they tempted God, saying, is the Lord among us or not? The issue in Exodus 17 was their doubting of God's ability to fulfill his promises. And they had a questioning, doubting approach to God. And in that sense tempted him. They did not respond in faith. They responded with questioning doubt. You shall diligently keep the commandments, we're told in Deuteronomy 6:17. Diligently keep the commandments of the Lord your God, his testimonies, his statutes, which he has commanded you. You shall do that which is right and good in the sight of the Lord, that it may be well with you. You may go in, possess the great land which God has sworn to your fathers, to cast out all your enemies before you. And when your son asks you in time to come, saying, what do these statutes and testimonies and judgments mean, which God commanded? You're to say to your son, we were Pharaoh's bondsmen in Egypt. The Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. He showed signs and wonders great and sore upon Egypt, upon Pharaoh, upon all his household before our eyes. He brought us out from thence, that he might bring us in to give us the land which he swore to our fathers. And the Eternal commanded us to do all these statutes, to fear the Eternal our God for our good always, that he might preserve us alive as it is at this day. And it shall be our righteousness if we observe to do all these commandments before the Eternal our God as he has commanded us. God brought us out, and he commanded us to keep his law, to fear him, to stand in awe of him for our good always. A very crucial approach in terms of transmitting right values and transmitting the fundamental value that God's way works. We're told several things here, that God commands us to do these things for our good always, that he might preserve us alive. God's law is for our good. It's not for our bad. It's not there to harm us. God's law does not keep us back or deny us anything that is for our benefit. In no way are we going to be better off by departing from the law of God. You know, a lot of times young people say, well, I need to go out and try the world to see if it's really that bad. My response is, why don't you stay and try the church and find out if it's that good? You know, if I'm told that one thing is good and one thing is bad, and I want to find out, logic and common sense ought to say, start with what you're told is good. Because if what you're told is bad is really bad, then you may be in a mess by the time you get around to trying what's good. If what you're told is really good, then once you try that, you're not going to have any interest in going to try something that's bad. You know, it's like if I'm told that this tastes good and this tastes terrible, and now I have two dishes set before me, and I say one of these dishes, this tastes delicious, it's great, you'll love it. The other is horrible. Now, you can only have, you're going to have to try one bowl at a time. All right, I've been told one tastes good and the other tastes horrible. Which one should I try first? Well, if I have any level of confidence at all in the person that told me, I think I'm going to start with the one that I'm told tastes good. And if it really does, well, that's great. I haven't wasted my time with what tasted horrible. Now, there is an approach here that we're told. We're told that we, first and foremost, have to internalize a set of values that is predicated on the fact that is summed up in the realization that the God that we serve, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is the one true God. There's one God, the true God, the Creator God. And we're to love God with our whole heart and mind and being. And that is to be the basis of the choices we make and the things that we do. That God's law, if we love God with our heart and mind and being, then God's law we want to direct us and to direct our approach. We're reminded to be careful of losing sight of God, of forgetting about God when things are going well for us. We're told that we're to stand in reverence of Him and awe of Him, and we're to serve Him. We're told that we are to diligently observe everything that He has said. And we're told that the way in which we're to transmit that to our children is that when they ask about why we do certain things, that it is to be presented, it is to be conveyed in a positive note. Starting out from where we were and how and by what means God has led us to where we are. That we are to tell them about God's greatness and God's power. That we are to lay stress on the fact that God has brought us in, He has commanded us these things, and He has taught us to do these things for our good, that He might preserve us alive. God tells us and commands us His law for our good. God's way works. Plainly and simply, God's way works. What God commands us is for our good. God desires to preserve us alive. He desires to give us and share with us good things. Now, Deuteronomy 6 sums up the emphasis on the fact that God's way works. God's law is for our good, and God gives it to us for our benefit, that we might be preserved alive. Now, the corollary to the fact that God's way works is the fact that the world's way doesn't work. See, that's the corollary statement. If God's way works, the world's way doesn't work. Now, we find many examples and many summations and statements of that. But it comes down that there is one way that is going to endure. There's one way that's going to last. And there's another way that is going to pass from the scene. There's one way that is going to endure, and there's another way that will not endure, that will pass away and will never survive and endure on into the future. And there's a contrast between those two ways. Now, you can go through the story over and over as we go through the pages of the Bible, and we see the illustrations. When Moses had finished giving these injunctions to the people recorded in the book of Deuteronomy, you know the story, it came on through. And a short time after, Moses died, and after a period of formal mourning, the children of Israel crossed the Jordan River led by Joshua. And they came in to the plain there of the Jordan River and camped in the plains of Jericho. And the siege of Jericho began. They shut up the gates of Jericho. And you remember the story of the Israelites walking around the city of Jericho every day for 7 days. And on the seventh day, they walked around it 7 times and shouted, and the city fell. Now, Jericho was the capital of the Canaanite Confederation. It was a major strategic area. And it had quite a formidable wall. It looked pretty impressive. It had withstood many sieges. There was one person in Jericho and her immediate family who had the perception to realize that the God of Israel was the true God, that the idols that were worshipped in Jericho were nothing. A woman by the name of Rahab. She's listed in Hebrews 11 as an individual of faith. She demonstrated faith and confidence in God. She was faced with a decision as to with whom she would ally her life and her future. She and her family members were the only inhabitants of Jericho to survive. Because the walls of Jericho came down. The inhabitants of Jericho died. There was one person in her family that survived that. And that was because they came to distinguish which way worked and which way didn't work. She made the right choice. It's like you've got 2 doors set before you. One leads to abundance. One leads to good things. It leads to the way of joy, as Mr. Zenon brought out in the sermonette. The other way leads to destruction. It leads to heartache and headache. It leads to grief and misery. It leads to unhappiness. God's way works. And it is important to convey that. That is the crucial role that we have to emphasize in our responsibility as parents. The crucial role of conveying, of leading our children to the realization that God's way works. And the basis of the church youth program has to be reinforcing that value that is being taught by the parents. But I think we have to understand something that is vital, and that is the fact that the church cannot rear the children for the parents. Simply can't. Won't work. Hasn't worked, won't work. Doesn't work. That the church can be in a role of backing up and of reinforcing those things that the parents teach. But the church cannot be a substitute parent. The church can't take the place of the parents. You know, that lesson was driven home to me many years ago. In fact, I guess it's about well over 20 years ago, when I was teaching at Imperial Schools in Pasadena, California. And in the course of that time, I was impressed at the wide disparity that existed. We had some very fine kids in Imperial, and we had some, flat-out little reprobates there too. The difference was not what they got at school. They sat in the same classes. They participated in the same activities. They were exposed to the same teachers. The greatest and the most significant difference, and I observed it, as I say, over 21 years ago, and I have seen it reinforced many times since then, that the greatest and the most crucial role was played by the parents. Now, I think that the church can and should play an important and a positive role. But I think that we so often live today in an age of specialists, to where people expect somebody else to come in and to take care of this or that. The church can be there to help. It can be there to back up, to reinforce. It can and should contribute to a positive environment within the church community, for positive reinforcement. But the church cannot be a substitute parent. It just won't work. If Imperial Schools, who had the kids 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, plus extracurricular activities, if they couldn't rear the children for the parents, how much less can we do it in the local church when we maybe have them 2 or 3 hours a week? Just from a standpoint of time, our impact is very limited. So in terms of leadership, that involves having in mind where we want to go. That we want to lead our children to the realization that God's way works. The management part of it is, how do we get to that point? Leadership involves knowing where we want to go, realizing that the end result of everything we manage, everything over which we're a steward, all of our stewardship and management is directed toward an end result. Now, the management part of it is, we're told here, the approach, it has to do with teaching and talking. Teaching has to do with the organized and more formalized instruction, the opportunities to develop. God's way permeates into every facet of our life. God's way is not compartmentalized into a couple of hours on the Sabbath when you go to church. When you start going through the Scriptures, we find that God's way has to do with everything about our lives. There are principles in the Bible that deal with health and nutrition. There are principles in the Bible that deal with family relations, that deal with financial management, that deal with acquiring skills and working diligently, that have to do with all sorts of things that are covered by biblical principles, that there are specific instructions that relate to. So we should certainly teach, and both in terms of what we ourselves personally do and encouraging that our children take advantage of those opportunities and programs that will help them to sharpen the skills that are needed in all the areas of life. So it involves teaching godly principles, sharpening the skills that are based on godly principles, and it has to do with talking about how those godly principles relate in everyday life and circumstances. Because you see, when it says talk of them, when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up, that doesn't mean that you just preach to somebody day in and day out. It means that you are taking advantage of everyday circumstances. The way that you interact, it obviously presupposes that you're interacting, you're spending time together, and when you're working together, or when you're taking a walk, and when you discuss life and life circumstances, that you take advantage of those opportunities to relate godly principles, to set an example of someone whose life revolves around godly principles, and doing so in a positive way, in a thankful and an appreciative way. Because the whole way it's brought out and illustrated here in Deuteronomy 6 is in the context of being thankful and appreciative for what God's calling, for God's calling, and for the fact that God's calling has brought us out away from things that are oppressive and destructive, and that God in His mercy has given us the opportunity for something far better. It has to do with a positive approach. So the management aspect has to do with using circumstances, whether it is in the area of discipline, in the area of teaching and skill development, and all sorts of areas that are focusing in on a direction, and that direction is to bring them to a point as they mature, the realization that God's way works. Now let's look a little further. I want to focus on one other aspect that I think has played a big role in recent years, and something I think maybe that ought to be addressed under this concept that we see here in Deuteronomy chapter 6. And that has to do with the relationship between character development and personality development. It's interesting if you survey the literature that has to do with success, and we've had success-oriented literature in this country going way back. Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, Poor Richard's Almanac, which Benjamin Franklin wrote, and other things. There's a tremendous amount of success. That was success-oriented literature. You go back and you read some of those things and some of those principles. There have been a lot of writings in this country that have focused in on success. But one thing that becomes apparent if you start surveying the literature relating to success and relating to child rearing, child training, one thing you find is that beginning in the aftermath of World War I, increasingly and really becoming more and more heavily emphasized after World War II, you find the increasing emphasis on the development of personality, on personality development. You can go back, Dale Carnegie, one of the pioneers in some of these things, his book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, a very influential book in terms of management, in terms of let's say, success orientation. Now, there's nothing wrong with having a good personality. There's nothing wrong with learning how to get along with people and how to relate to people and how to make a good impression. Those things are fine. Those are well and good. I'm not against that. But the problem is that along with an increasing emphasis on personality development, there has been a corresponding decreasing emphasis on character development. Because the historic emphasis in those areas, if you were to survey the literature, you'd find that for roughly the first 150 years, we'll pick 1776 as a starting date since that represents the beginning of American independence. Beginning with 1776, you'll find for roughly the first 150 years, the primary emphasis had to do with character development. You'll find it if you go back, and it's interesting, if you go back and just look at the readers that children learn to read with at an earlier time in history, you'll find that the emphasis was on developing good character. That there was a strong emphasis on right and wrong, on character development. The old McGuffey readers that were very heavily used in the United States from perhaps about the 1840s on up through for about a 50-year period. And of course, some of them were used on up even after the turn of the century. But they were the most commonly used readers in this country during much of the 19th century, certainly the last two-thirds of the 19th century. There was a heavy emphasis in terms of character, in terms of the stories that were given. If you were to look at the books that were written that related to success, the emphasis had to do with developing the proper character. Now, there has been that part has been gotten away from. It has been more and more neglected with a corresponding increase in the emphasis on developing the personality. Now, the problem, of course, is that character has to do with what you are. Personality more has to do with the way that you relate to other people and the way other people perceive you. But character has to do with what you are. The problems that we're having in this country right now, the economic problems, ultimately are problems of character. You know, they're not problems of personality. Ghastly. If some of these people hadn't had winning personalities, they never could have sold some of these things. You know, you can sell a bill of goods if you've got the personality to do so, and you don't have the character to avoid taking advantage of what your personality allows you to do. Ultimately, we're looking at violations of God's law. The economic problems in this country can clearly be summed up. They are the result of sin, plainly and simply. They are the result of sin. God has several laws that specifically relate to economics. 3 come to mind immediately. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Thou shalt not covet. Now, don't those relate very directly to economics? An awful lot of what has transpired certainly would come under the classification of covetousness. When you look at a nation that has bankrupted itself, Mr. Zenon was talking about the national debt. Well, those problems couldn't exist if nobody had stolen, lied, or coveted. When you're craving things that you haven't earned, things that you're not entitled to, that's what covetousness is. And our nation has wanted that which it had not earned, was not prepared to pay for, but we could imagine it, or we saw somebody else that had it, and so we coveted it. And a lot of modern theft, where it involves manipulations of stocks and bonds and things of this sort. It can involve the spirit of theft, of taking unfair advantage. If you just go through and you just look at those 3 commandments, you realize the tremendous economic implications that they have had. The problems we've had have not been because of a lack of personality development on the part of some of these people. It was from a lack of character development, a lack of moral integrity, because their lives were not centered around principles. Ultimately, our lives have to center around something. Now, some people's lives center around themselves, and they spend their life sort of centered on the self, and the main thing thereafter is that they don't want to feel any pain, they don't want to experience any difficulty, they just want to enhance the self, and their great aim in life is to avoid pain. Well, you don't make a whole lot of gain that way. It becomes a very self-oriented approach to life. Increasingly, we have experienced that in this country, this sort of an obsessive preoccupation with self. People's lives can center around self. People's lives can center around other things. Some people's lives center around money. You know, they give up and they sacrifice a lot of things in order to acquire money or prestige or material things. They may sacrifice a lot of personal convenience in order to acquire or to achieve a status in the eyes of others. There are people whose lives may revolve around other people, may revolve around their friends and their social group. And they'll do almost anything to be accepted, to be approved of. A person's life can even revolve around other people, can revolve around family members. A person's life can revolve around many things. But the basis of character, if our lives are going to revolve around the right things, says you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. That sounds like a life that is centered on God and God's laws. And that's going to control the way we relate to everything else. To our mate and to our children and to our friends and to our job and to material things, to all the other things. See, it's not wrong to relate to these other things, and certainly we're involved with a variety of things in our lives, whether on the job level or the social level or the family level. But what is going to be at the center? What is going to be at the center of our lives? If character is going to be the emphasis, then God and His law has to be at the center. That has to be at the center. It has to do with a devotion to right principles. Now, there are a lot of things that can be used in the development of right character. There are many, but there are principles that have to be taught. You know, even having the various activities that we have, even games and sports, can be tied in with character development. It's sort of interesting. I don't know if you've ever read very much or studied much about the development of organized games in terms of school-sponsored games and sports. You'll find that, of course, people have always pursued various types of sports and games for recreation. That's just spontaneous and just arises because people enjoy doing things. And they enjoy doing things to relax and to pursue recreation. That has always been the case. But it was not until in the early part of the 1800s that the concept of organized games as a part of a school curriculum was developed. That began in England. Some of the exclusive private schools there in England, through the 1800s, particularly the mid-1800s, began heavily around 1840. The development of, though it had already begun a little earlier, this emphasis on organized game sports as a part of the various things like this as a part of the school, and something that was organized in that context. Many of these private schools, and it's interesting why they did it. The thinking behind it was that they wanted to use it as a means of character development. That was the original concept that was used. In fact, it was later said that the British Empire was won on the playing fields of Eton. Eton was a very exclusive private school during which many of those who became the future leaders of Britain and the Empire, that's where a tremendous number of them went to school during their teenage years. And the statement was made that the British Empire was won on the playing fields of Eton. Now, what did they mean by that? Well, the things that were the most heavily emphasized and the games that were developed and the way in which those games were emphasized was based on the fact that they wanted the children, as they matured, to come out of there with certain concepts. Always to play by the rules, to appreciate and value fair play, and to that those were matters of character that they wanted to emphasize. They wanted to emphasize a rigorous competitive approach. They wanted to go all out in order to win. They placed a lot of emphasis on that, but it was tempered by the fact that you had to always do it. You needed to strive your hardest to win, but you always had to do so by following all the rules and never, ever take unfair advantage. Now, these were the sort of the concepts that some of these various games were developed around and through that period. And it led to, the whole purpose was to develop an attitude and an approach in those that were going to be the future leaders. It's sort of interesting because those concepts of fair play and a respect for fair play and for following the rules was in many ways one of the greatest strengths that the British exercised in terms of their empire. Because if you look at the story, if you just read the history, you'll find that the British Army never amounted to more than what was called a thin red line. Now, they called it a red line because the traditional red coats that they wore in ceremonial wear, the color that represented the royal family, represented the Queen, but it was called a thin red line because there weren't very many of them. It was one of the smallest armies in Europe, far smaller than the armies of corresponding nations. But they exercised control over a vast empire that encompassed over 25% of the world's landmass and over 25% of the world's people. Not because they had the strongest army, but they were highly respected for that concept of following the rules of fair play. There was a respect that they had that meant that in many of these areas they were deferred to and they were respected. You can, even if you just study the history of the United States and Canada, one of the most interesting contrasts that comes out has to do with the way in which the West was settled in both countries. The model that was used. And part of the consequence was, I don't want to get into all of that, that's sort of an aside, but one of the most interesting contrasts is that Canada never experienced Indian wars. This United States, of course, experienced devastating Indian wars. Canada did not experience Indian wars in their winning of the West at all, because of the level of respect that was had for the Mounties and for the representatives of the British government there. That sense of fair play that was emphasized, that was a part of the great emphasis. Now, obviously, a lot of that emphasis on character has been lost, not only here but there as well. The point is that when we're looking at godly character and to the nation, and to the extent that someone reflects, or that a nation reflects godly character, God can and does bless. See, Deuteronomy 6 goes through that and talks about that. What God gave us, He gave us for our good. He commanded His laws to us for our good. If we're to effectively function as parents, first and foremost, we have to realize that we're not just managers and controllers, we're to be leaders. In leading our children, leading our youth, the youth of our church, to the realization that God's way works. Now, there are a lot of things that can be done that can help to develop that, but we've got to have that approach very deeply embedded in us And everything we do has to have as its ultimate concluding thrust the fact that God's way works. That we are first and foremost concerned about the development of right character. Character that is based upon a godly centered life, a life that is centered on godly principles. The realization that God's law is there for our good. And when that part is there, when that is properly emphasized, then yes, there's certainly opportunity to learn to develop our personality more effectively, to relate to others around us better. But the real key is going to be the character that we have, because it has to do with substance or simply outward form and appearance. What we have seen increasingly, and part of the problem that we're experiencing in our nation, is that increasingly, and we see it with our politicians, that it is a matter of outward show. It's a matter of personality. And they hire political consultants to package the candidates, sort of like you would Campbell's soup or something. So you design an effective packaging. And they get these media consultants and they get on there and they package things in a certain way. They project a certain personality. Tell them, oh, you know, what you need to do is you need to change your hairstyle, or you need to change your clothes, or you need to, do this or do that. And all of these peripherals are focused upon. Because after all, we're trying to sell a product. And those that can project the most telegenic personality, in other words, they come across the best on television. When you're watching them on the tube, they somehow project a certain sincerity, a certain warmth, a certain charisma. They're likable. Boy, that's great. Well, we're getting what we're getting what we deserve in that sense, because those who are in leadership capacities may project a certain personality, but fewer and fewer seem to evidence any depth of character. And the problems that exist internationally, nationally, and right on down to the local and personal level have to do with problems that revolve around a crisis in character. Character is based on the inculcation of godly values, the realization and appreciation of the fact that God's way works. And there's no more valuable thing that we can convey to our youth, that we can lead them to see and to appreciate and to accept as they mature, than the realization that God's way really does work.